Grace to you and peace from God our Father and from Jesus, the light of the world. Amen. I don't know about you, but the recent storm that crippled the D.C. area and closed schools for more than a week and even forced the cancellation of our worship service is one of the worst that I have ever experienced. And I grew up in the Allegheny Mountains of western Pennsylvania. It was also the first time in almost 40 years of ministry that we canceled our services before the first snowflake ever hit the ground, which made me a little nervous and also perversely happy that the storm did not miss us and that our preemptive DC panic was well-founded. But the thing that made that storm so bad for so many of us was not the amount of snow, because we've had much bigger accumulations. It was the ice that came and formed on top of the snow. And it was a thick crust that was hard to penetrate. In fact, instead of making tracks, my neighbors and I were walking on top of the ice, on top of the snow, and taking a lot of extra time and back-breaking energy to penetrate that ice. And as we chipped away at the ice in our driveways with garden tools instead of snow shovels, it occurred to me that there are two things that are well known for melting ice. And those two things are salt and light. As I watched the water starting to drip from our front porch, whenever the sun came out, even though it was still bitterly cold out, and little specks began to appear on the sidewalk where the salt had previously been scattered. And that is my little midwinter analog to the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5, when he preaches to those who would follow him and says to them, "You're the salt, and you are the light, and you have the power to penetrate hearts that are cold, and they've been hardened by sin, and by sins that have been committed against you, and by all of the other changes and chances and possibilities that can cause us to put up our defenses against this new life that leads us into the heart of God." If you're a regular here at St. Andrew, you know that I like to unpack these little metaphors, these sermon illustrations of Jesus, including a third one about a city on a hill, to see exactly what he's saying to us, what this all means for us. Because even though it's very obvious to us that salt melts ice and salt adds flavor to our food, the fact of the matter is that when Jesus preached that sermon, it meant far more. And that's because in those days, before refrigeration existed, salt was also a preservative of things like meat and fish and other food, so that they wouldn't rot or spoil, so people wouldn't go hungry or literally starve to death. In those days, before there were salt mines all around the world, salt was a very rare, precious, valuable commodity. So much so that Roman soldiers were even paid in salt instead of in currency. And that payment to those soldiers was known in Latin as their salarium, which is where we get the English word salary. And it's why we refer to somebody who doesn't do a very good job as somebody who just isn't worth their salt. We know that back in those days of Jesus, people would carry pouches of salt on their belts to use not only as seasoning, but also as money, as barter. And then when two people entered into an agreement or a covenant or a contract with each other, they would seal the covenant by taking a pinch of salt from their pouch and putting it into the pouch of the other person, and vice versa, so that your salt could never be distinguished from the salt of that other person. And you would say to that person, "There is salt between us." And there's so many other things that I could say about salt and what it means and how valuable it is, both then and also today. When Jesus talks about light, He's also talking to people who could not go home from that sermon and flip a switch and turn on the lights in their homes, because there were no lights like that. There were no lights in the streets. There was no light like that when you were having surgery. All they had were little oil lamps that they had to keep filled every night, and they had to keep their wicks trimmed over and over again just to give enough light to navigate through the house. Think about that the next time you're in Times Square. You're sitting in a dentist chair, or you're watching the Super Bowl. Last year we learned that here at St. Andrew, there are more than 900 light fixtures in this building alone, about 930 to be exact, but not so back then. And when Jesus talks about the city set on a hill, there's a pretty good chance that he was referring to a specific city, and that was the ancient Galilean provincial capital known as Sepphoris, which was built on top of the hill, only about 5 miles from Nazareth, and it could be seen from miles away. And because there was no GPS, because there were hardly even maps during those days, Sepphoris, the city on the hill, helped people to navigate, to travel, to find their way. Because a city set on a hill cannot be hidden, because a light put up on a lampstand gives light to the whole house. And when you put all those metaphors together of the salt and the light and the city on the hill, and you put them into their original context, you begin to see what Jesus is really talking about. And what he's talking about is the impact and the influence that followers of Jesus, like you and me, can have in this world. What he's saying is that when we're the salt of the earth, it can have the power to melt the ice and penetrate the hardness of every home and every heart. That when we're the light of the world, we can shine in a way that clears a way for people to a new life that is always better in the heart of God. When we're the city set on a hill, we can position ourselves in such a way that people can see us and think of God and give glory, not to us, but to the one who makes us new. And so being the salt of the earth can mean a lot of things. It can mean being persistently present to someone whose heart has been hardened by the trials of this life, by loss, by walking in the darkness away from God until somehow grace makes its breakthrough and the ice begins to melt. Being the light of the world can mean shining in a way that exposes corruption and sin and selfishness and prejudice and the other works of darkness that sent us away from God. Being the city set on a hill means that you can position yourself and just live your life as an example to others, so that when they see you, they might say to themselves, I want to know the Jesus who makes a difference in that person's life and be changed forever. And so we are called to be the salt of the earth. We are called to be the light of the world. We're called to be the city set on a hill, to shine forward, to be the people that God has called us to be. And sometimes it's difficult for us to do that, of course, because we live in a world where there is a lot of coldness, where hearts are cold, where it's like ice. And when we are called to be the agents of light and salt for the healing of a nation, of a world filled with nations. Some of you have been like me in following the tragic story this past week of the abduction of Nancy Guthrie, mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie. And yet, in the midst of their suffering, which is unimaginable, in the midst of that video that their children released, that many of us saw, what we heard, what we saw, was an incredible testimony to faith, where in the depth of the worst moments of their life, they addressed their mother and they said to her, "You are God's precious child, Nancy." And they said to her, "God is with you, even in this valley." I don't mean to minimize their pain one little bit, but I'm here to tell you that's what the light of the world looks like. That's what the salt of the earth looks like. And light cannot be ignored when it shines through the darkness. Salt cannot be ignored when it preserves and transforms life. And while I don't wish that kind of an experience on anybody, if you have to go through it, that's how you want to do it. And it's hard, because so often, I don't know about you, but I get up in the morning and I don't want to be the light of the world. I don't feel like being the salt of the earth. But then comes the word of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus doesn't say, "Mark, I want you to be the salt of the earth. I think you have the potential to be the light of the world." He says, "You are the salt. You are the light. You are the city. So go and live that way for the healing and hope and transformation of this world." Before his death in the year 2011, the Anglican theologian John Stott wrote his commentary on this passage from the Sermon on the Mount. And in it, he says this: "If a house is dark at night, there's no sense blaming the house, because that's what happens when the sun goes down. The question to ask is, where is the light? If meat goes bad, there's no sense blaming the meat. That's what happens when bacteria are allowed to grow unchecked. The question to ask is, where is the salt? The society becomes corrupt like a dark night or a stinking fish. There's no sense in blaming society. That's what happens when people are left to themselves and human evil is left unrestrained and unchecked. The question to ask is, where is the church?" On a cold January winter evening in 1989, former President Ronald Reagan, who you may have voted for, you may not have voted for, delivered his farewell address to the country after the end of his presidency. And near the end of that speech, he compared it to a city set on a hill, because he was invoking a vision that was put forth centuries earlier by a man by the name of John Winthrop, an English lawyer and an early pilgrim who became the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Reagan said, "In my mind, the city on a hill is a tall, proud city, God-blessed, teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it," he said. "That's how I see it still." The vision of the late president of that city on a hill was not his alone. It was not John Winthrop's vision alone. It was the vision of the one who preached a great sermon on a hillside with this message that has the power to melt the ice and change the world. And with all due respect to the late president, I do need to clarify one thing, that what this really is, what it always was, what it will always be, is the vision of Jesus Christ for the church. Not for the nation, but for the church of all nations, all around the world. When he says you're the salt, and you're the light, and you're the city, and you have the power to penetrate the hardness of hearts and melt through the ice and lead people by the light of God to a new life that is always better Shortly after the construction of New York City's Empire State Building in 1931, it stood 102 stories tall, the tallest building in the world for the next 40 years. And at that time, one of the workers was interviewed about his work because he was among those who put the mast on top of the skyscraper. And they asked him, "Weren't you afraid to be up there so high above the ground?" And his answer was, "Absolutely." But then again, not many people have the chance to alter the skyline of a city. In a sermon that still preaches to us today, the living God is calling us to alter the skyline, not of a city, but of the entire world. And to do it with salt and light, with bread and wine, with baptismal water, with grace, with truth, with witness and friendship, and with love for one another, because of the one who first loved us and in whom you are of infinite value in your ability to make an impact and an influence and to show the world around you that even though there's still a lot of ice out there, there is an opportunity to know that in Jesus Christ, a new springtime will absolutely come. And so may God bring out the best in all of us and make us good salt shakers and light spreaders and a city on a hill and happy warriors who go out and make an impact with the good news of the one who came and served and loved and died and rose again, so that we, valued infinitely by him, can be part of his family and walk into this new light that is always better, even in the middle of a storm. To God be all the glory. Amen.